Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna keep watching the Punic Wars, but this is from a different channel. This is Extra History instead of Oversimplified, because Oversimplified doesn't have one on the second or third Punic Wars. So this is the Punic Wars, but it's the second Punic War begins by Extra History. This is their second episode of their Punic Wars series. So we kind of throw ourselves into the story here, right? Because they have one on the first Punic Wars, but I already done that one on Oversimplified, so I thought let's just jump into the second Punic War, right? Original videos down below, and let's go.
Welcome back. Let's have some more Roman history, shall we? When we left off last time, Hamilcar's son Hannibal controlled a powerful army expanding the Carthaginian territory in the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay, so we know that now, okay? So Hannibal, what was his name? Hannibal Barca? Hamilcar Barca. Yeah, his son, like we saw with at the end of Oversimplified's videos, that his son is Hannibal, the famous Hannibal. Okay, so he controls an army in the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, we know that. Okay, and now the second Punic Wars
Today we begin the Second Punic War itself.
Okay.
Hannibal's campaign in Iberia was slowly taking his army ever northward. Eventually, his...
Okay, one thing though, the famous thing that I know about this one, about the second Punic War, is I think he crosses the Alps with the war elephants, right? We saw the war elephants in Oversimplified's video, right? So I'm guessing we're gonna see it in this series. It's gonna be amazing. Let's watch.
His territory expanded dangerously near to the Ebro River, which the previous Carthaginian ruler in Spain had established as the border where Carthaginian influence ended and Roman influence began. Obviously,
Okay.
The Romans were not fans of this development, but here's where it gets murky.
Sure.
To this day, historians can't agree on which river the Ebro River referred to in the treaty actually is, which makes interpreting what happens next simply a matter of deciding who you believe. You see, there was a Greek colony in northern Spain called Saguntum. It was a prosperous trading city, and they had recently signed a treaty with Rome. The Romans claimed that, according to the Ebro River Treaty, this city was sacrosanct and under their protection. But Hannibal claimed it was on the wrong side of the river, and therefore part of his territory. The year is 219 BC.
I mean, great wars, or not great wars, but wars in general starts with small disputes on borderlands, right? On something some people disagree about, and then it turns into something else. A great war. Like the First World War, right? It's very one of the most famous things about the First World War is that it starts small and then escalates and escalates and escalates, right? Whole armies, countries' armies are being revamped, right? Like Germany, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, Belgium, right? Then Italy, Romania, all of these countries, right? Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire. Like, it just escalates. It looks like, to me, this is also an escalation, right? Okay.
Hannibal is 26 years old, and he remembers the oath his father made him take. Never be a friend to Rome. So he attacks, laying siege to the city, rebuking the Roman embassies that come to him for all the wrongs Rome has done Carthage. For 8 months, the Saguntines hold out, all the while pleading to Rome for help, begging their...
One thing, though. Sorry that I'm jumping in here, but one thing, though, about this. Yeah, it's about that the Second Punic War basically sort of begins by the end of the First Punic War because of a humiliating peace treaty of some sort, right? And then obviously Rome takes Sardinia and Corsica, right? So, like, again, I don't want to contrast World War I with this, but to me it's it's almost the same equivalent, right? It starts off pretty small and then escalates. And the end of the First Punic War ends like the First World War. So, okay.
Their ally to come save them from what, without aid, is their certain doom. But Rome sent no troops. They had recently become embroiled in a war in Illyria, the Balkan region north of Greece, so never sent the aid the Saguntines were counting on, figuring that Saguntum could hold out on its own until their own Balkan war was done. but Hannibal's forces were too much for them. At long last, with the Saguntum population starving and the defenders falling back from outer wall to inner wall to the citadel of the city itself, Hannibal emerged victorious, and his army pillaged the city, selling into slavery everybody they didn't kill. Now, this is the point where Rome might have been able to prevent the Second Punic War. Might have nipped it in the bud, but by not acting on their treaty and not rescuing their ally, they brought 20 years of unimaginable war upon the Mediterranean. When Saguntum fell, Rome sent an emissary to Carthage to offer them a choice: surrender Hannibal to Rome or face war. The emissary stood before the Carthaginian Senate, surrounded by all the great men of Carthage, and said to them, "I hold before you both peace and war." The leader of the Senate spat back, "Choose what you will." The envoy replied, "I choose war." And the entire chamber exploded with shouts of, "We accept it." And now it's on. Hannibal's off the leash. The Second Punic War has begun. The Romans begin to prepare for war. They send an army down to Sicily with one of their consuls to get ready for an invasion of Carthage in North Africa. And they sent their other consul off with an army to invade Iberia and capture...
Very interesting, though, that they... Pretty smart, they've learned. They did this as well. It failed, but it almost won them the war pretty early, right? That's pretty smart. You go down to Sicily and then you go to the heart of Carthage, the city Carthage, right? And then obviously they want to stop Hannibal in Iberia, so okay.
Carthaginian holdings there, leaving a small force of recruits to make sure that the Gauls in northern Italy don't take this as an opportunity to cause mischief while the bulk of the military is away. And now is probably a good time to take a moment to talk a little bit about Roman politics, because it's going to become very important in a second. You see, in Rome, each year they would elect 2 consuls to be the heads of state. These guys would function more or less like the US president, except that they each had veto power over the other. And unlike the president, who is supreme commander of the US military but doesn't actually fight on the ground, these guys would also be the ones to lead the Roman armies into battle. They were very much the generals on the ground, choosing the strategies and directing the battles. Of course, they weren't amateurs in this. You had to have 10 years of military service to even be eligible for the lowest political office in Rome. Nonetheless, we're going to see how politics affect this war pretty soon.
I mean, you can see how the Romans actually... We saw it in the first Punic Wars, how the Romans were aggressive go-getters and were rewarded for success, while the Carthaginians were punished by defeats. You can see why Rome will be so great of a empire, right? 10 years of military experience to even be... to have a position of a low political... or have a low political position, right? That shows you sort of a future, right? They're gonna expand. That's pretty cool.
For now, back to Hannibal. Hannibal is a clever guy. He realizes that trying to defend North Africa is a losing proposition, and he knows that fighting on his own turf in Iberia will only result in a slow defeat. So he plans to...
That's pretty smart, right? So he probably knows that the Romans are going to invade Carthage again, like they did in the first war. He said also, like, he knows that there's no point in having a war in Iberia, because it's just going to be a slugging match, and probably the Romans are going to win in a slugging match. So what I'm thinking he's going to do is just invade Rome, like the Romans thought of invading Carthage to end the war quickly. Okay.
To do the unthinkable and invade Italy by crossing the Alps.
Yep.
Now, of course, that's the one thing the Romans didn't plan for. The army they left in northern Italy is nothing but raw recruits and the dregs of their former forces. All of their real soldiers are either heading south to prepare for an African invasion, or making the trek across what is now France to invade Spain. And
this is a problem, though. Or not a problem, but this is a contrast, or not contrast, but this is like an example here, right? You have the Napoleonic Wars. You have your right flank and your left flank. Let's say Napoleon at Austerlitz. He attacks the Allies in center and left flank, believes his right flank weak, and the Allies attack his right flank with their left flank, which is strong. So it's like a yin and yang, right? Here with the Romans, they are going to Carthage and protecting and sending troops to Iberia as well, and protecting the northern flank a little bit against barbarians, whatever, right? But Carthage is doing, or Hannibal is doing the same thing, right? He's going straight to Rome, and he doesn't care about, or he cares probably about Iberia and Carthage, but, right, both are aggressive go-getters. So it's down to who can get the decisive battle and victory first, and who gets to the places first and strikes, right? Because Hannibal can go to northern Italy and attack, but he can be stopped there, and it can be a slugging match up there, while the Romans are taking Carthage and are in Iberia, and it's over, right? So it's dangerous for both parties. Okay, interesting.
That's where the first skirmish of the war happens. That Spain invasion force runs into Hannibal as he's making his way to the Alps, and their scouts clash. A few hundred cavalry from each side run into each other unexpectedly and come to blows. The Roman scouts manage to push back the Carthaginians. It's nothing decisive.
See?
The important thing is that they live to report this news back to their commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio. You're going to want to remember that name, Scipio. You know how on the Carthaginian side you have the sons of the great general Hamilcar from the last war, fighting together on a blood oath they swore to their father to avenge the shame Carthage suffered at the hands of the Romans? Well, this guy is their Roman equivalent. This Scipio we just met will eventually die on the field, slain by Hannibal's armies, but his son will later crush Hannibal and turn the tide of the war, and his great-grandson will go on to sack Carthage and wipe them out forever, 70 years after the story we're telling. See,
oh my, 70 years, so that's probably the third Punic War. Oh my. How long? Okay, so between the first and the third Punic War, is that like 100 years or 120 years? Wow.
That's part of what makes the Second Punic War so epic. Blood oaths and vengeance, rivalry from two great houses, a war passed down from father to son, two bloodlines vying for the fate of the world. It's awesome. And this battle is their first meeting where the whole rivalry begins. Scipio, now aware of Hannibal's invasion force, tries to give chase, but Hannibal manages to slip away. Without the resources or the logistics in place to do otherwise, Scipio makes the fateful decision to have his army press on toward Spain as planned, while he himself speeds back with all haste to rally the forces in northern Italy. Hannibal, meanwhile, continues his march across France. The Romans expected him to be slowed down by hostile tribes, just like they always were when they tried to cross Gaul, but Hannibal has planned ahead, and he already offered the tribes generous gifts and the promise that his fury has only one target, Rome. And
the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Even though the tribes might not have allegiance to anyone, like he said, the Romans were always attacked by the tribes, by the Gauls. But then Hannibal comes in and says, all right, here you have some things here. You hate Rome? Oh, I'm going to sack Rome. I'm going to attack Rome. Just give me free passage and let's go, right? Smart.
The plan works, mostly. He does still get halted by the local forces once. At the Rhone River, a band of Gauls with Roman allegiances assemble an army on the far side, intending to prevent his crossing. However, unbeknownst to them, Hannibal has already sent one of his officers, Hanno, known as Hanno, son of Bomilcar, to differentiate him from Hannibal's own son, also named Hanno, just to be perfectly confusing. Anyway, Hannibal already sent Hanno with some handpicked troops to cross the river upstream. So Hannibal makes to cross, the Gauls assemble on the opposite bank to stop him, and then, just as planned, Hanno comes bursting out of hiding and assaults their forces from the rear, scattering the Gaul force and leaving the way open for Hannibal's army to continue their march.
Look at that.
Haste was essential for Hannibal, as it was already September, and he had to get his army across the Alps before it got any colder. Even at this pace, the conditions they faced in the Alps were brutal. There is a reason why this march is one of the most famous events in military history, and why its audacity caught the Romans entirely by surprise. And that's because everyone thought it was impossible. There was no way you could march an army through the treacherous peaks of the Alps in the beginning of winter. It simply...
I mean, it makes sense why they thought it was impossible. Because, okay, maybe you make it, but then your army is so weak that it can just be defeated, right? So, you can understand the Romans' point of view. But then Hannibal does it. And I mean, yeah. It's like in World War II when the Germans invaded through the Ardennes. Same thing, right? Oh, you can't have tanks through this thick forest, right? Oh, there's no way. And then they do it, right?
Could not be done. And yet, Hannibal went and did it. He dismissed the less reliable members of his army at the foot of the Alps and began his ascent. The weather was brutal. Men froze to death, mules fell from the frozen cliffs still laden with the army's food and supplies, hill tribes attacked them and rolled boulders onto the narrow paths, ice and snow beset them the whole way, and at times men had to crawl to make it along the tiny mountain track. But they did it. In the end, they made it to Italy. But
I have just one question. If anyone knows this answer, write in comments, but how did he get the elephants through there? If he did get elephants through there. Like, if mules fell and men had to crawl, I mean, probably in some places they took the elephants where they could have the elephants go, but I mean, still, wow.
The cost? By some accounts, Hannibal had 98,000 men when he started the climb,
Wow.
and only 26,000 when he set foot into Italy
Yeah.
on the other side. Upon
Wow.
reaching Italy, Hannibal gives his troops time to rest from the arduous crossing, and tries to recruit the local Gauls to his cause, as they have no love for the Romans either.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Scipio is racing toward them with whatever handful of troops he can assemble, knowing full well what Hannibal intends. They meet, and come to blows in a whirlwind cavalry engagement by the Ticino.
Wow.
The larger, better-trained Carthaginian cavalry dances circles around the Roman infantry and the few cavalry Scipio could muster. The engagement is small, but a decisive defeat for the Romans, a defeat in which Scipio is gravely wounded, and would have
Wow.
lost his life if it weren't for a heroic rescue by his then 18-year-old son fighting by his side, a man we will later know as Scipio Africanus. So Scipio withdraws to recover and regroup. This skirmish may not have been a major victory for the Carthaginians, but it's an enormous boost to their morale after such a
Yeah, I mean, after they crossed the Alps, and what was that, like 25% of them made it, or maybe 30% made it. Or they got some rest, of course, but still, wow, incredible.
grueling journey, and the local Gauls, upon hearing of the battle, start to think Hannibal's army might have a chance, and they begin
Yep.
defecting en masse. Now Rome is worried. The other consul, Sempronius Longus, is recalled from Sicily, and he and his legions start marching north to join Scipio's battered command.
Okay.
When he arrives, Sempronius immediately starts pressing for an attack, but Scipio, having already seen Hannibal's army in action, cautions against it. Sempronius is eager, though, hot-headed and looking to brawl. He believes...
Wow. I mean, good for Scipio to learn that his enemy is strong and intelligent. And he sort of got defeated by them and almost died. So that's good to learn from your mistakes. But sometimes people see, oh, there's an opening here, I can attack, and then they lose. But let's see.
Scipio's caution is born of his wounds, and thinks him cowardly to not attempt to drive this invader from Roman soil.
Also makes sense,
Scipio
but okay.
advises they use winter for training. As you'll remember, the men left in northern Italy were raw recruits, or the remnants of a previously defeated army. But
Yep.
here's where the Roman politics comes in. The next year's elections are drawing near, and Sempronius wants a glorious victory for his faction and his family before this term's done. He is not going to be denied this opportunity. Now, while each Roman consul is actually the supreme commander of his army, when two consuls are together, they alternate days for who is in charge of the whole thing. Hannibal knows this, and he also knows about Sempronius' temperament, which he uses to bait a trap.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, Hannibal knows his enemy. And the enemy sort of doesn't even know him, even though they probably know he's the son of a famous sort of guerrilla warfare fighter in Sicily, right? That's good for Hannibal. He learns and he knows the ins and outs of Rome, the politics and the military. Wow.
Early one morning, after sending his brother Mago with 2,000 hand-picked men to hide behind a small hill, Hannibal sends out a detachment of cavalry to harass the Roman army, who are camped just across the river Trebia. It's the winter solstice, one of the coldest days of the year. Sleet is pouring down, and the sun's just barely beginning to rise when this detachment is spotted. Sempronius orders the chase, and his men leap out of bed, throwing on their armor, and prepare to engage. The Carthaginian cavalry retreats across the river, and Sempronius gives chase. He orders his men to wade across the water. The men drag themselves to the other side in full armor, sometimes up to their necks in the freezing water. Once across, it's clear that Hannibal is willing to meet them in battle, so the troops are ordered to form up. Think about how long it would take to get 50,000 men organized and in formation with nothing but shouting and some flags. It takes hours. So here the men are, standing in the sleet, soaked from head to toe with frigid water, roused before dawn and launched into a chase without even time for a meal. It's probably been half a day since any of them have eaten. Meanwhile, Hannibal let his men sleep in and had them around big roaring fires eating a hearty meal before forming up. Now, to add to that, put yourself in the Romans' shoes for a moment. Imagine you're a provincial Roman farmer. The most you've seen of the world is maybe the length of Italy if you're really well-traveled. Now, imagine that through the sleet and the mist, you see a great gray lumbering bulk begin to emerge. Imagine you see the...
Even though Romans already have fought against elephants, but it was in the first Punic War, which was, what, 20 years ago? I don't even know, right? Maybe 10 years, I don't know. Right? So... yes, a generation could lose, because if you only been in one place as a farmer and then you in the military, you maybe have heard some stories, but that's all. Maybe seen like a clay tablet or whatever of what an elephant looks like, but then what? Still, Yeah, this is
creature
terrifying.
2.5 times as tall as you, at least
Yep.
a chariot length long, with glistening white tusks and a distended snout. Its
Yep.
eerie trumpeting carrying across to you faintly on the wind. This is probably the closest that human beings ever got to legit fighting monsters. Fighting something so alien and gargantuan that there was no frame of reference for them. The average Italian had probably never even heard of an elephant, much less seen
Yep.
one before. So
Yep.
imagine lining up against that, and knowing that you'll have to fight such a thing with just your short spear and your sword. Now, despite all of those disadvantages, the Roman infantry fared pretty well at first, more than
Wow.
holding their own against the hodgepodge of Numidians, Celts, and Spaniards that faced them, but the exhausted Roman cavalry is driven off the field. The Numidian cavalry then
Yep.
wheels around and attacks the Roman flanks. At the same time, Mago's forces that have been so patiently laying in ambush spring onto the Roman rear and everything starts to collapse.
Yeah.
Though Sempronius escapes with his life, the Romans' retreat leaves more than 25,000 dead.
Wow.
For the first time, the Romans
Dead.
see this is going to be no easy war. Join us next time for the continuation of the Second Punic War. Thanks for watching.
Wow. Yeah, imagine being one of those soldiers just looking at an elephant, a war elephant, right? And having to fight that. And even imagine in the first Punic War, when they actually was probably the first time they've ever seen these. In the second Punic Wars, there were probably some, I don't know, general or something that probably was in like Sicily or something and fought against them in the first Punic War. Maybe. Right? And maybe they have stories of it. Which makes sense. But you haven't seen it and you haven't experienced it, then there's not much you can do, right? Yeah. Alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.